I think it's about time. It's lovely to see all of you in the chat room. So, welcome to this special Bastille Day event. My name is Anna Rubo, and on behalf of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization, I welcome online participants from here in New York, across the world, and of course in Australia. And I see some friends from Sydney and Melbourne. Before we get started, can I remind everyone to mute the microphones and to turn off your cameras? And please remember you are warmly invited to submit questions in writing in either the chat room or the Q&A box. There will be 15 minutes for questions. Now, I must confess that this talk is of special interest to me. I was born and raised in Melbourne, and I am of the generation that finished their education, in my case, an architecture degree at Melbourne University, got a job, worked just long enough to save some money and left. In our view, Melbourne was really boring. Well, many of you know that our speaker, Rob Adams, played a pivotal role in changing Melbourne and the CBD from a boring place to one of the most vibrant and diverse cities imaginable. These days, people flock to Melbourne to experience its urbanity, its rich cultural life, and of course, we shouldn't forget its football teams. And while happily ensconced in New York, every time I return, I think, gee, I could live here very easily again. So now, Rob Adams. He joined the City of Melbourne in 1985. As City of Melbourne architect, he helped write and implement the rejuvenation strategy for central Melbourne. This has resulted in Melbourne being voted the world's most livable city on 7 occasions. He has received various awards, the Prime Minister's Environmentalist of the Year in 2008, the Order of Australia, and the Institute of Architects Award in 2018. The team that has implemented these changes that he led has received over 160 international and state and local awards. Now, Rob has an international profile and has represented Australia on the Cities Council of the World Economic Forum since 2008. And he's also, since 2020, has fulfilled an advisory role and a mentoring role as the city architect, while also setting up his own practice. Now, while knowing about Rob Adams for many years, I have only met him recently. We were jurors on the SDGs 2030 Award, a partnership between the Union of International Architects and UN Habitat. Over 120 projects from 40 countries were submitted in 6 categories, with projects addressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, awards were made at the just ended World Urban Forum in Katowice, Poland, with many prizes going to young architects who, working with communities, have brilliantly addressed social and environmental issues in developed and developing countries. As we confront many climate and other emergencies, the need for innovative and constructive action could not be greater. Melbourne, under Rob Adams' leadership, would seem to have anticipated the Sustainable Development Goals and has been an exemplar in achieving sustainable urbanization. So it is a very great pleasure to introduce you to Rob Adams. Rob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Before I get started, I'd just like to, and it looks as though my screen is, oh no, there, that's better. I'd just like to respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking from, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I also respectfully acknowledge the Boonwurrung and the Djadjawarrung and the Tanawurrung and the Wadawurrung as the traditional owners of the Eastern Kulin. These lands have not been ceded and really have been curated over 60,000 years by the traditional owners. And it's that challenge really that sits before us as to how we, in fact, take these lands forward. When I came here in 1983 as a consultant, I was employed by the City of Melbourne to help write a strategy plan. The strategy plan that was published in 1985, and at that stage I was asked to join the city. The city back in 1983, as Anna has mentioned, was not a city of vitality. It was one that had emptied its center out to the suburbs. It didn't have a residential population, and really it was on its way down rather than up. It was really the councillors of the day that decided they needed a strategy that would change the city. And it was a city that didn't have much money. So the strategy had to be simple and able to be implemented. And while it was a large document, it could be summarized. The vision was to make it a 24-hour city that looked and felt like Melbourne. And that seems like a very short sentence, but both a city that is going to be 24 hours is obviously going to be a mixed-use city, and one that feels like Melbourne is to look at yourself rather than others for the solutions taking your city forward. And that's exactly what happened in Melbourne's case. There are, I think, there's a very simple structure, I think, to good cities, and I've given you a reference to this document that I've used since 2002. If you have the characteristics here of local character, density, mixed use, high quality public realm and connectivity, and you do that through a process of public participation and integrated action, that city becomes one that is economically vital, socially cohesive and sustainable. But the mechanism by which you do that is adaptation. We're not building a new city. We're adapting the city we've already got. And I'm going to take you through 10 initiatives that we've done over the last almost 40 years now in trying to adapt our city for this future that we think is more sustainable and more equitable. I'll start by the character, what makes the character of a place. When I first arrived here, they were looking at conservation studies because they were worried about their heritage buildings being locked down. But character comes in many forms. It comes in the forms of the materials that city is made of, in our case, bluestone. It comes from the morphology of the city, the way it was laid out by the early settlers. And all of those things make up the character of the city. And most cities have their own characteristic. And that's important we understand that and work with those. Something as simple as the paving. The bluestone paving back in '85, we decided rather than have multiple paving surfaces in the central city, and we would have bluestone paving. There was very little, for instance, in those areas. You can see the yellow shown here, the few locations where there were bluestone pavings. But now this is a slide, going back to 2014, and it's obviously extended since then. Most of the central city is paved in the bluestone. And people have come to accept that bluestone is Melbourne's material. It's a great walking surface. It's resilient. It allows you to put activities like sidewalk cafes and public art onto it. So it's become one of the characteristics. But more importantly, the character of this city was made up by the way it was subdivided. The blocks were large blocks, 200 meters by 100 meters. And these were subdivided in the 19th century, not for planning reasons, but commercial reasons, to make more money. You got more money if you could subdivide them into smaller holdings and give access to them. And out of this, you got a grain and lanes and arcades that became very much the character of Melbourne. In the 1960s, that started to change. Blocks were being consolidated, international architects were coming, and you were getting single large buildings that took up the character of the city. You can see the middle slide here is the back of Collins Place, and it runs on one of the little streets. And if you do that enough times in the city, you will kill it. You change it from the streets that are above in the top slide to what you're getting in the center. Over the last 40 years, we've mostly shown the sides so many times that they've actually changed that. And the bottom slide is what it looks like today. They've started to activate the streets, and I'll come back to how important that is. The lanes themselves that were created to provide access into these blocks were very characteristic of Melbourne. And we've got hundreds of these lanes. And they've been changed from, in many cases, vehicle service lanes to pedestrian lanes, lanes where people stop, have a meal. In fact, you can see the street here has been closed and the tables and chairs are down the middle of the street. And that's become part of the characteristic of central Melbourne. The second initiative was to realize that any good city needs to be mixed use and it needs to have a reasonable density. Why does it need to be mixed use? basically so you can walk to anything within 10, 15 minutes that you need within that city. And the density is really to provide a critical mass of people that live downtown, that support the services that are already there. And I think one of the biggest adaptations we're making in our cities today is not to build more infrastructure, but to adapt the existing infrastructure so we use it more economically and to greater utilization. So one of the challenges in Melbourne was how did you add mixed use and density and activation that comes from that. And in the strategy plan, we said we would add 8,000 units in the first 15 years. We had no idea of how we would do that. But the opportunity came in the late 90s when the property market crashed and too many office buildings had been built and people moved from the old buildings into the office buildings. And we were able to take some of those old buildings and through a program we call Postcode 3000, get them adapted for residential. And you can see a building here that was one of the telco buildings added on to by a local architect, Nonda Katsoulides, and turned into residential. And this process of adapting those buildings was one that then led to the creation of new residential buildings. So back in 1982, we had 685 dwellings in the central area, not a population that had any impact really on the economy of the central city. By 2016, through this project, we got to 41,000. In fact, it's closer now to 60,000 as we sit here today. This has a dramatic impact on any city. If you put 60,000 people who are pedestrians, 92% of the traffic in this area is on foot. 45% of these people don't own a car. Most of them are local, and therefore they start to stimulate the local economy. The interesting thing is we didn't have to add much infrastructure to accommodate this population. Many of the toilets, for instance, were low water toilets, etc. So to my knowledge, only one water main has been added to the central city to accommodate this population. And that was mainly due to its age rather than its lack of capacity. But what happened is when you bring that population, you start to get food and beverage following it. So you can see in 1982, the food and beverage, and by 2012, it's gone to 1900. And that brings vibrancy, life, employment to the central city. The same was happening with retail. We were losing our retail to the suburban shopping centers. And back in 1982, you could see 1,900 retail establishments. The turnaround saw this go to 2,400. And now we are competing with the suburban shopping centers. In fact, they look to us now for retail strategies as the centers become stronger. And what that also does, that bringing of densities, is it's made the city a cheaper place to work. The rates are charged to the individual property owners, and they regulated by the state to 2.5% increase a year. And in many years, that increase hasn't occurred. Add a population, and you've got a greater number to divide it amongst, and you can see how the rate in the dollar has dropped substantially over that period of time. The third thing, and mostly the most essential one in local government, is the partnerships you make. And I'm dwelling here on projects, but later on there are other partnerships around sustainability. Using your own assets in partnership with others, be they private sector and government, to achieve better outcomes for the city. And I've listed a few of the ones we've got done here. I won't go through all of them because we haven't the time. But I'll give you some idea of what happened as we went through. Tyne Eldon Street was a small site we owned in Carlton. It had an open lot car park on it, a house, more cats than anything else in it. We decided to swap that land and give it away to a developer on conditions that they built 220 underground car parking spaces. And this is, way back when parking was important, which doubled the parking. We also subdivided above the car park, and they then built 23 townhouses and connected the lanes up through the site. We retained the car park, and the revenue we get from that, as you can see, was 892,000 back in 2015. The important thing is knitting together a piece of city. Another one that we did was to take a city square that was failing. You can see it on the top right. It had been built on the principle of a lot of architectural features, but the basic fundamental principle of good public space, of having activities that open up onto it, wasn't present here. We decided to sell off to the bottom of the water wall. You can see there, we got 17.5 million for that. In partnership with the state government, we put that together to open up the Regent Theatre, which had been dark for about 20 years. We also got the developer to contribute to the square. We put 400 car parking spaces below the square, and the revenue from that was 3 million a year. And what we got, I would argue, was a better square, one that had activity along its frontages and was a place that people used. There were other projects, and I won't go through all of these. These slides will be available to you, but this was the purchase of a whole city block, putting in place some very simple principles: 20% open space, new lanes and arcades, 40-meter height limit on the front of the site, 2,000 short-term car parking spaces. Again, something that we resisted, but politically was required. But what we did is we made it flat floor, habitable ceilings, and already one of the full floors in this building has been converted back to residential. And we held the property through until practical completion so that we get the quality we wanted. The next was about affordable housing. Postcode 3000 brought a new population, but it didn't actually provide the affordable housing we wanted. This was a heritage building we took in partnership with Housing Choices. We gave them the building. They borrowed money through the state government program, where if you had 25% of value, the federal government, would put in 75%. They built their 59 dwellings, refurbished the bottom, and gave it back to us on a 100-year lease. So we got a renewed property with 59 affordable housings, and we ran the community services out of the bottom. The latest one we've been working on is the Queen Victoria Market. And here what we've done is taken the land that we had control over, which you can see in the top slide, and we've repackaged it, including the roads and lanes to the south, into a development site. And we've then undertaken with the state government that we will undertake certain actions, but we will sell off the site to the south, and we will use that money to refurbish the market. And that's exactly what's happening. And that site is currently out in the market for tendering, and refurbishment on the sheds, etc., is almost complete. Part of that project was to take the open space that used to be a car park, the car park that we want to make into an open space, which is 1.75 hectares, and take the cars off there and put them in an adjacent building. So we bought a site, and it's called the Munro site. It has community facilities. It also has 500 underground parking spaces for the market, replacing 720 that were on the site. We also have affordable housing. This is built to a 6-star rated communities rating, as well as a building rating. The interesting financials of this, you can see on the bottom slide here, and we haven't got time to go through in detail, is basically having spent the money, then looked at the fact that we had to, in fact, build community facilities, getting back the value of the strata title. And the strata title, you can see on the bottom right hand, we retain everything that's in green: the car parking, the community facilities. The affordable housing is above the community facilities, and the developer's strata title has the strata title that is blue. We get the value of that site back. We've got a residual value of our own site. But the thing that changes this whole equation is we get back the 1.75 hectares of open space, which was worth $118 million. And that substantially makes this a profitable project for the city. You can see from the plan on the top right-hand side, it's a combination of lanes, retail. There is no back of house here that's discernible. So you're getting good streets and good lanes. The fourth intervention was, Melbourne was a very car-dominated city in 1985, and we moved very quickly to push public transport, walking, and pedestrians. We did this through what we call Greater Green. We slowly started taking away asphalt, not making a big song and dance about it, because people might have actually stopped us from doing it. But we started to look at how we could put greater bike access, pedestrian, and priority to trams. We also here you can see some of the asphalt we were taking away, and this is just a small sample. But in Lygon Street, one of the first ones, we widened the footpaths, put medians down the center of the road, planted trees, and made it more of a people space. In the central city, we took parking off one side of the street, widened the footpath, and gave that back to the pedestrians. And this whole process has escalated over the years. One under construction at the moment is South Bank Boulevard, where we're taking back half of that boulevard in a high density area to put back into open space. You can see from this diagram, the orange, green, and blue are the areas we're taking back and turning into open space. Roads like this will become open spaces. One section, or well, a number of sections now finished, and this whole scheme will be complete by the end of this year. The other thing we did was to take away underperforming infrastructure. Sorry, can someone go on mute there? I think it's Wendy. Things like the rail yards. 56 rail yards coming into the central city. We decided that with the state government, there were only 12 of those. We could take away the balance and put the marshalling yards at the end, and then realize a vision we had back in the 1985, which was to take an area of the city that was divided by these rail lines and connect up this park network that runs across the whole eastern side of our city. So the rail network became open space. As you can see here, we got the privilege of designing and building this, and that became the event center of Melbourne, and took the pressure off the green parks, which were less able to accommodate it. As we talk, there are a number of projects going into the ground, and over this period of 40 years, we've taken 80 hectares of asphalt out of the city and converted it to public space, widened footpaths, and bike routes. The example you can see here is a road that's in Carlton that was turned into an active public space. And the one on the right-hand side was the traffic island that was 500 square meters in size. And by taking the road and just one-waying it around that, we got 5,000 square meters of open space. Why is that important? It's not only the fact that we've transformed people into walking population and cycling population, but when we looked at what open space we needed for our added population, and I had parks and gardens in my portfolio for 10 years, we would have had to buy space that would cost us $700 million. $700 million that we didn't have. Here we're converting road space into open space and not having to pay for it. And in that, we managed to keep up with the open space we need for our population. We added bike lanes, as most cities have done, and we're certainly not at the forefront here, but we're certainly trying to catch up. And many of these have gone in. At the moment, the state government is also looking at adding a new metro line. I say thinking of it is adding a new metro line, of which we've been a partner in. And this will dramatically increase the number of people who can access the central city. During COVID, we accelerated the program of bike lanes and pedestrianization, and many of the streets saw temporary installations of parks, etc. And the major project that our Lord Mayor is running at the moment is called Green Line, which is to take the whole northern bank of the Yarra River and convert it into a pedestrian-friendly area, similar to what's happened on the South Bank many years ago. The fifth one, and this one is the one that I'm most passionate about, is a high-quality public realm. Why? 80% of the public space of any city is made up of streets. And therefore, the one-liner that I like to think sums this up is, if you design a good street, you'll design a good city. And that would seem so simple to do, yet we seem to have such difficulty in achieving. What makes up good streets? People. People that have easy walking surfaces, people that have activities in the public realm that they want to stop and linger at. All of those things go to make up a high-quality public realm. And we've concentrated on this since 1985. We, in fact, changed the central street through Melbourne, Swanson Street, from being 60,000 cars in a day to, in fact, being accessed only by trams, pedestrians, and bicycles. It was an area of the city that was dying anyway. And although many people bemoaned this change, what we saw happen fairly quickly is the pedestrian numbers increasing from 12,800 to up to 47,000 by 2070. And there are 65,000 people who walk down that street every day. This is the street today. And, you know, it speaks for itself. This is a people street now. It's no longer dominated by cars. We went around the city and took small areas, small public space by the town hall, designed and built a cafe on that, cut a hole in the town hall on the right-hand bottom slide and opened that up as a tourist information center, paved the city, put a flower stand on the corner to make this a vibrant area of the city in Swanson Street. We took traffic islands, converted them to celebrate the populations we have. This is at the top of Little Burke Street where we have our Chinatown, and it became no longer a traffic island, but a place where people could meet. I've spoken about the city square and how we took from the bottom of the water wall and changed that and made that a more vibrant space. So this process of slowly adapting the city is one which incrementally has taken place over the last 40 years. The other aspect of good streets is that they are cared for. You used to have to stand in the middle of the street to catch a tram. Now you can stand with reasonable comfort on the footpath, under a shelter, with a seat, good lighting, and move across the tram when it arrives. We also put public art into the city, and we used public art quite extensively, sometimes to hide utilities. But we also, and I had arts and culture in my portfolio for about 8 years, we put artworks on a temporary basis into our laneways. So we stimulated the laneways by making them exciting places for people to go. And these were temporary installations that went in, and these are the ones that went in about 2006. We also realized one of our key factors was coffee. Coffee is our secret weapon. We've got a very strong European population and Italian, and we make good coffee. And it was a case of giving people places on the streets where they could have coffee, where they could buy magazines, where they could buy flowers or fruit. And when you've widened the footpaths, back in the 1980s, we had 2 sidewalk cafes. By the time we got to COVID, we had over 500, and we had 800 new applications to put sidewalk cafes into the streets. These are the sort of activities, combined with the street furniture, etc., and all of these were designed in-house, that have helped make up and change the public realm of our city, so that now it's valued by its citizens. The 6th intervention came while I had the parks and gardens in my portfolio in the year 2000, and we had what was called the Millennium Drought. Unfortunately, there'd never been a drought that had gone for 11 years. This was not a drought. This was the onset of climate change. And what it did was devastate our tree population in our parks. Many of our parks were old, our tree stocks were old. We'd been planting trees since 1985, and you can see here the before and afters of many of those trees. And these were the trees we'd put into the central city. By the time the 11-year climate change impact hit us in the start of the 21st century, we were in real trouble. And 2 things we did. We had an urban forest strategy where we undertook to reforest the city, and we had the open space strategy. This is where we got that figure of $700 million required. And we started to look at how we got more public space into the city. The extent of that devastation was that we, in a city that was known as the Green City, stood to lose 48% of our street trees over 20 years, not only street trees, park trees as well, if we did nothing about it. So we put in place an urban forest strategy. I told my staff at the time, don't talk about trees. The trees in Australia are emotional. Are they exotic or are they local trees? Talk about what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to go from 22% to 40%. We're trying to get greater diversity. We're trying to have healthy trees. We're trying to get water to them. And that strategy, because it made common sense and people could understand it, was adopted. We followed that up by plotting every tree in the municipality. We were looking at their life expectancy, obviously to get that 48% that I showed you previously. And in doing that, we put them on a map. If you came to Melbourne, you can Google Melbourne urban forest, and you can walk past a tree and you'll get its details. And each detail had an email address. And what we found is people started emailing our trees. It might have been a career limiting move, but I allowed my staff to respond to those. And the whole program went viral. It was taken up and Bloomberg featured it at a conference that was held in London. The next one, the seventh, was if you're going to have trees in a dry country like Australia, you're going to need water. And we were starting to get less water, and we're starting to get it in larger amounts over shorter periods. So we put in place an urban city catchment policy, taking water, storing it in the ground in tanks. And you can see here on the right-hand side, the water runs off the street into a tree that's actually below the surface of the road. That fills up and waters the tree before it gets into the pipe. The strategy is to try and keep the water out of the pipes for as long as possible. All these blue lines you see on this map of central Melbourne are where we put in treed medians down the center of the road. The black asterisks are water tanks, and the city flows down to the river. And these water tanks are not only designed to capture water and reuse in the park, but they're designed to slow the overland flow so that we don't get flooding down in Elizabeth Street as we've had in many years. This is typical of the medians. They proved a boon in COVID because people could go out and use them. In fact, that's my family on the right-hand side, using this on a Friday night for our Pizza Friday. We also looked at permeable asphalt. So where there were parking areas, we put a sub-basin, then we put permeable asphalt, and then we planted the trees. They got readily supplied by water every time it rained. And we also collected the overland flow and put it into things like retarding basins and purified the water. This is in Royal Park, and used it back in the city. The tank in one of our most historic gardens, Fitzroy Gardens, was only possible because we owned a depot. This was a 5 million litre tank. And what we did is we actually took a depot that had been randomly built over many years. You can see on the left-hand side, we rationalized the depot. Then we used the open space that was created to house the tank. Oops. Sorry, it's going to let me do that, is it? So this is the open space here where the tank is under, the rain garden, and this is the rationalized depot. What that basically did was give us 4,000 square meters of new space. It gave us 5 million liters of water, and it gave us facilities that helped the park. This is in fact the cafe we designed, which is covered in greenery. We similar projects of putting tanks under roads around Melbourne. This is under a road by Darling Square. The rain garden was put back over the top, and the water was used in the adjacent park. We also changed the way we looked at our landscapes, the plantings. They went from being high water usage on the left-hand side to low water usage, woody meadows on the right-hand side. The eighth intervention was greening of buildings. And CH2, which is the building you're seeing here, was the first Green Star, 6-star Green Star building, commercial office building in Australia, similar to LEED in America. All of our buildings since 2000 have been 6-star rated. And this building proved itself not only through the energy and water it saved, but in COVID, it proved itself to be possibly the healthiest building in Australia. We were taking air in under the floor, bringing it up into the working environment and taking it out in the ceiling. So instead of mixing it, as you can see in the top slide, as in a conventional building, we're using a displacement system. This is something we had seen as being important. And ironically, this is the thing that paid for all the interventions in this building. It was evaluated independently by the CSIRO and Adrian Lehrman that we were saving 10% on staff's well-being and productivity. 10% of the salaries in this building is $2.4 million a year. That meant all of the innovation that we put in this building was paid off in 5 years. These are the things that we need to do in our buildings. We've done other buildings. This is a completely timber library down in Docklands, which we did with Lend-Lease and Claire Design. And we had, you can see the left-hand side is the internal of that building. The right-hand side is a small library that we designed internally, which is East Melbourne Library, which used ground source heating, bowling club that we use, where we use underneath the bowling greens, we run out the tubes, and we use that to help heat and cool the building. And this is a recently finished childcare centre. The ninth initiative is one of the public-private partnerships again, and could have been in the previous list. And this is called MREP, which is the Melbourne Renewable Energy Program. What this did is we went into partnership with 21 partners over 2 projects to build 2 wind farms and generate 198 gigawatts of renewable energy. These are used by the partners to, in fact, offset their energy usages, which come from more conventional forms of energy provision. This partnership, I think, is most probably one of the most exciting ones that I've seen happen in recent years. It was followed by one that is being implemented now, which is called Power Melbourne. And Power Melbourne is about putting small batteries around the neighborhood so that we can put the renewable energy straight into those and decrease the amount of energy being transported from vast distances. Australia is one of the highest uptakes of solar roof collectors, and therefore those batteries can be used. I'm conscious of time, but I want to end on what I think is the future. The future is how we adapt not just our central cities, but our metro area. And in 2010, with the Victorian government, we wrote a report called Transforming Australian Cities. And what we did is we looked at our cities that have this central core and low densities, like many American cities, and said, what can we do to change this? Because clearly this is not working. We've seen how we could adapt our environments, and I've just spoken to you about that. So why couldn't we adapt our cities? Unfortunately, what happens in Melbourne, and I'm sure happens in many other cities, is whenever we want an increase of population, we put it on the fringe in those blue hatched areas, further and further away from the infrastructure people need. And a study done by Griffith University shows that we're increasing the poverty of the populations that live on the fringe. The vampire study measures vulnerability to petrol prices and mortgages. And you can see it's increased over those 5 years on those fringe areas. A few weeks back, or a few months back, the Automobile Association costed the cost of owning a car in Melbourne, $22,400. If you're on the fringe, you need 2 cars. So it's close to $50,000 you need post-tax just to make your life viable. What could you do if you came into the central city where 45% of the people don't own cars? $4,000 a month in your pocket by not having to own a car changes the whole economy of where you live. Living on the fringe with a cheap house and land package is not the cheapest place to live. In fact, arguably it's the most expensive, and it is detrimental. Now, the areas that suffer bankruptcy whenever we get an increase in interest rates, which is about to happen again. They're the areas where family violence is dominant, and that is built out of frustration. They're the areas where obesity and poor health conditions occur. You're more likely to die of a heart attack if you live in the suburbs than if you live in the central city, because you don't walk. And the cost of that, you can see 58 billion is absolutely staggering to Australia. So how do you change this? I looked very quickly at something that happened to me back in 1969 when I was a student, and I just traveled for 9 months in Europe. And I came back to do my thesis. And what I saw was that the universities overseas were expanding. In 1970, Cape Town University, and this is the campus of it, had 5,000 students. It built on the side of Table Mountain and couldn't expand because it was surrounded by a national park. When I asked the planners what they were doing, how they were going to expand, they said, we've asked a different question. The question we've asked is, how well are we using the stuff we've got? I went back 40 years later and they'd built nothing and they'd trebled their student population. What were they doing? They were using their infrastructure more efficiently. And that is the key to what we need to do in our cities in the future. I'm going to do this very quickly because I've only got a few more minutes. We looked at, if you put your populations in and around the railway station, the activity centers, you could get 860,000 people. And there are many activity centers in Melbourne. We've seen some of those, in fact, expand in their populations. If you put the populations on the road-based public transport, and you can see the change in the morphology from this aerial photograph. So you don't invade the residential areas, just along those corridors. You could, through a process, and there are many of those corridors, tram and bus corridors, we looked at the sensitivities. We measured every parcel in the metro area, and we took out the sensitivities. And I won't read these, you'll get them in the slide pack. But what we ended up with is, you could put 2.4 million people along those corridors. Corridors that looked like this, low density with high cost infrastructure running down the middle. Corridors that could look like this. And in fact, since then, many of them have started to convert. This is the same shot from that place I took the earlier photograph. And this is much of the development that's going into Melbourne. Not only could you put them in the corridors, but you can expand the corridors, because there's now a trackless tram that costs a tenth of the cost of a conventional tram. It's coming out of China, and I've been working with Peter Newman out of Curtin University and with the Sustainable Built Environment National Council to look at bringing trackless trams into Melbourne. They follow a white line, they operate on batteries. You can see the batteries on the roof, and they come out at a much lower cost and can carry the population. The last place we wanted to put our population was, in those brownfield sites, and you could get 500,000 there. So the diagram was along your corridors, in your greyfield sites, but not in the residential areas. And those residential areas became your new green wedges. They were where you could put solar power on your roof, plant trees, catch water, and walk out of those to activities and job possibilities. What does it look like? How do you plan for it? This is an aerial photograph. These are the corridor areas we're talking about. We tested one going up to Melbourne University, where you can see the corridor has the density on, and immediately to the right of this photograph, it drops down again. Very simple mechanism. Keep your heritage, try and build no higher than 5 to 8 stories, bring your cars in from the back if you're going to have car parking, give active frontages, and what you end up with is a good city. A city that could look like this, or look like this, and give that vitality back. These are the metrics of that. You could fit double the population of Melbourne into 7.5% of the land area. And you could do it by building no higher than 5 to 8 stories and around your existing infrastructure, so you don't have to build new infrastructure. The savings by doing that are $550 billion. It's $110 billion for every million people you add to the metro area if you put it within the existing infrastructure. So we've talked about these factors that make them up, and the source of that information is down the bottom of the slide. And I've tried to illustrate some of the ways that we've adapted our cities. We've also recently localized the Sustainable Development Goals. And the little diagram you can see in the bottom, which I'm sorry, it's a bit small, we've tied all our Sustainable Development Goals back to all our strategies. We are trying to work to make sure that everything we do in the city in the future makes it more sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Absolutely fascinating talk. Wow. I am looking here and finding that there's quite a lot of activity in the chat room. And people who are very taken with the sorts of things that you have been saying. And I thought one of the questions that's coming up is about the transferability of the Melbourne initiatives. Now, you came to New York to help reimagine Times Square, I believe. And so could you describe how that came about and the degree of receptivity to radical change?
Sure. Look, one of the reasons I like to give this talk is I think most of this stuff is transferable. I mean, it's easy enough to take away asphalt, widen footpaths, and plant trees. You mentioned New York, and one of my great mentors and someone who's been very generous to Melbourne is Jan Gell. And I spent 6 months with him in 2006, where I just took a bit of time out, we just had Com Games and finished CH2. And I just needed some brain space. And After that, he said, look, we've been asked by New York to look at New York. And would you go and just walk through New York and have a look at what we can do? And I walked with his team. And once you start looking at streets and saying, which space do we actually have to need? For instance, you can't park right up to an intersection. So you can take the first 20 meters from an intersection and widen the footpath, plant a tree, maybe put a rain garden in. Many of the lanes in our streets are too wide. You can narrow them. You can take away a lane and start giving it to pedestrians and bikes, which actually is a far more efficient way of using it. You can get 6 cars through an intersection that takes 250 people in a tram in the time that you get those light changes. So we all know that. So this is transferable. It is absolutely transferable. And that's what makes me excited about it, because I look at the American cities and South American cities and the African cities. All of them have the characteristics that I've talked about, this, low density spread city with a central core.
Right, excellent. Okay, we have another question in the box, which the questioner says, I'm curious if you could revisit the Transforming Australian Cities work today. What components or strategies would you reevaluate, knowing many of these patterns are present today? Thinking about how these built form and performance-based strategies could be supplemented with more passive landscape-driven approaches.
Right. Look, there's not a lot I'd change. I mean, I've done subsequent work with many people, and Peter Newman being one of them, where we've looked at, if you're going to suggest to people, for instance, that you put populations along the corridors, how do you ensure that you get quality corridors? How do you ensure that these are going to be reasonable places to occupy, live in, sit in the streets and the cafes? And so what we've done is we've started to finesse it. But the basic principles of putting that population in and around, activity centers and along the corridors, I think is still right. And it's getting a greater hold in Melbourne, and many of those areas are transforming. As for the passive energies, if you're only using 7.5% of the city, quid pro quo, 92.5% of it is in most cases suburbia. This is where you can in fact put solar panels on roofs. You can in fact put back the simple thing called a water tank, where you collect your water in this dry continent of ours. You can plant trees, you can reduce the road space and increase the pedestrian areas. All of those passive things can go in. And as we've shown with the urban forest, we're planting 3,000 trees a year in our central city. That can be replicated over the whole metropolitan area and along the freeways between, say, Melbourne and Geelong, where there are these vast areas either side of our roads that we have for cars to run off on. With car restraint cables, you could make that a linear forest along there. So I think we haven't even touched the surface of what we can do. And really the opportunity now is to, stop talking about it and start doing it.
Right, okay. Another sort of slightly follow-up question from that is, how do you incentivize development or government to rethink the distribution of development similar to the 7.5 city?
Yeah, that's the hard question. I mean, we so set in our patterns of how we like to live and where we like to live and what our grandparents did and our parents did, that changing the paradigm is difficult. And that's why I showed a few of those slides around how much it costs you to own a motor car. I live in the inner city. I'm very fortunate, and I do own a motor car, but I share it with my daughter. And I reckon I use that motor car once a week. She uses it slightly more than me because she's got 2 young children, and I think young families mostly need that sort of mobility. But to own 2 cars is an enormous expense. And for each family that owns 2 cars to have to find $50,000 post-tax money to have those cars and pay the road taxes, the tolls on the roads and all the rest of it is something that I think people would start thinking about. So I think you've got to start talking to people about what it means for their budget, what it means for their health. Sitting in a car with the frustration of being in a traffic jam rather than walking or catching public transport. What it means for their family's life, the isolation of living in a suburb. Now, COVID has helped with this. COVID's enabled us to work from home. And I think I see a huge advantage there that people now mostly work 2 or 3 days from home. And I think that will help with the isolation. It also help possibly only having to have 1 car rather than 2 cars. So I'm optimistic about how that change can take place. But what's in it for governments? Why should they, take this on board? The amount of money cities have to spend on infrastructure is daunting. If you now say you don't have to spend that money, all you've got to do is put your, your population in and around the existing infrastructure. You could spend that then on, the infrastructure you do need, the hospitals, the schools, the social infrastructure that our cities are really needing at the moment. So I think governments need to start thinking about that as the political reason why they should do it. And in the end, 72.5% of their people are being impacted positively. And I think the other 7.5% are also being impacted positively, but that sometimes is hard to sell.
Rob, I would just like to ask you a question myself about issues of equity. Melbourne over the years has become, and indeed Australia, a much more unequal place. And so now we have sort of extreme wealth and probably, well, not extreme poverty, but poverty. And so I'm wondering, you mentioned the fringe suburbs, you mentioned the cars and so on and so forth, and the problems of infrastructure getting out there. And then you mentioned also the crash and the way, or the 92 financial crash, which enabled housing in the inner city. So has COVID sort of freeing up any real estate for that? And if so, and I know you've already mentioned that there's a good amount of affordable housing, but affordable housing in Australia seems to me to be absolutely a key issue. For our North American friends, the median price of housing in Sydney or Melbourne is just ridiculous. So are there issues of equity, that the principles you're thinking about, and maybe you can relate this something to the goals that we've been sort of thinking about, and the ways you might go about this?
Sure, Anna. You've really put your finger on, I think, one of the biggest challenges we have. I mean, Melbourne is an inequitable city, sadly. If you take the central city alone, we need 6,000 affordable units to accommodate key workers and people who need to live close to the city to perform their work. And we've just set up a new unit at the city called Homes Melbourne. And I'm working with that team to look at how we get those 6,000 units. We can get about 300 or 400 of those by using our own properties, as I've shown, and doing the public-private partnerships. But that's only scraping the surface. We can work with the state government on many of their lands to, in fact, convert and increase the density of affordable housing. But the major part of that is going to need to come from a change in planning policy. While Melbourne might have done a lot of things well, what it has not done, and this is Metro Melbourne, it has not made affordable housing part of the requirement of any new development. So unlike Canada and unlike even Adelaide, where you have a percentage of affordable housing that's required to be put in place with every development, Melbourne is only starting to get there, and we're talking 5-6%. The city itself does 15 to 20%, but the planning scheme only in certain key development areas is doing 5 to 6%. That is a fundamental change. We will never provide sufficient affordable housing unless the planning scheme requires it with every new development goes in. There are some promising signs. I mean, New South Wales government has just talked about and it's not new in a global sense, but it's new here, a shared equity where they'll put 45% to helping people buy housing. And that's only for people who are key workers under a threshold of income. So I think the Australian cities and Melbourne are behind the 8 ball in terms of affordable housing. The prices, as you mentioned, are incredibly high and not helped by where they're being built. Particularly if you add on, as I've pointed out, the cost of the fringe housing. So the challenge, our big challenges over the next 20, 30 years are climate change and affordability. And if we don't get that right, the city is not going to be a pleasant place.
I'm going to give you one last thing from the chat, which is from somebody I know who works for the Wellcome Trust in London, who loved to talk, and says, I'm also interested in the transferability of these initiatives, their obvious impact on health and well-being, and how we can shift narratives around living well. Have you had much involvement with the C40 city network? If so, has this been useful for sharing ideas, learning from each other? Are there other cities that stand out to you with the work that they are doing? Thanks again.
Sure. Look, we have worked closely with the C40. In fact, one of the awards you mentioned was given to us for the work we did with sort of, the urban forest strategy and bringing, nature back in. So they are transferable, as I've mentioned before. Cities that are doing it well. When I was with Jan in 2006, we did a project for the European Union called Bauculture. It means good building, and we looked at 10 cities with strategies that had changed the nature of their city. And there were things, like, Glasgow, which was moving its population in the 70s to the fringe and knocking down the Gorbals, and then saw the futility of that and brought the population back downtown. And Glasgow is now one of those cities that's thriving through having done that. Copenhagen in itself is one of the early adopters of getting rid of road space and turning it over to public space, similar to what we've done in Melbourne. So we looked at many of the cities around the world that we're using that, and I'll give you links to some of the references I've mentioned in the paper that you can share. I think cities are starting to, cooperate far better through the World Economic Forum. There's greater cooperation. It's taken some time to get cities to the front of the agenda of the World Economic Forum. When I first went there in 2008, cities didn't even get on the agenda to be discussed at Davos. Now, in the last session, they were, front and center. So I think people are realizing that cities are where we can, in fact, not only solve our social and economic problems, but our climate problems. If we can, in fact, make our cities sustainable, most of our populations now live in cities, and it's going to be 75% by 2050 or thereabouts. So cities are the solution. And yes, I think many of the things I've spoken about today are transferable. They're not difficult.
Great. Well, I think that probably brings us to the end of our time. And I would really like to thank you for a very stimulating talk, fantastic talk. I can see in the chat room saying, how do we access this presentation? I'm not sure, I'm sure CSU will figure that out. I know the recording goes online, and I'm hoping that they can also upload the presentation, because there's clearly a lot of material in it that's very, very rich. So Rob, I would like to thank you on behalf of CSU for a fabulous talk. And I know I have a small message for anybody who's dealing with, who's looking at, let me just see what it is, for the professional, oops, I've just lost it. Anybody who is doing this for professional credit, let me just get to it. That the AIA continuing education credit is available by means of self-report. So with that, I would like to close our session and thank you all for attending, and thank you, Rob Adams, for a fabulous talk, and congratulations on all this work.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.